So it's a bit ironic given his tweet today, because when he, I guess, re-implements these Iranian sanctions, it's going to be hawkish for oil. It should drive the price up on to some margin. But his tweet this morning really was complaining about OPEC, complaining about the high price of oil. What do you think is rationale behind, it's obviously hard to get into President Trump's head, but what was the rationale behind the tweet this morning?
So I think it's important to talk about the first part of your question about the Iran and how much oil is at stake.
Yep.
And so we put out notes, and we've been talking about the Iran deal for over a year now, and basically in January said that we felt the deal was going to end this year, either in January or May. And so it looks like it's going to happen in May. But essentially, Iran, since the sanctions were lifted, has added about another 1 million barrels a day in crude exports.
Okay.
And so we think all of that 1 million barrels a day is at risk. I mean, the EU part of that is probably about 500,000 barrels. So you could say that the range is, I think, at least 500,000 barrels. But I actually do think it's closer to 1 million barrels a day. The EU pushback is that the EU won't go along with the sanctions, so therefore that oil won't come off the market. But the EU governments themselves are not buying the oil. It's the European energy companies who have great economic exposure here in the US. So if they're faced with the decision of closing up shop in the US in order to buy Iranian crude, I think that's an easy decision. And so a lot of people get sort of, faked out by the EU's not going along, so therefore it's not going to have any impact. It will have an impact. It will essentially impose global oil sanctions again on Iran.
Yep.
And the only question is, what does China do? What does India do? What would, because I think Asian countries like Japan and South Korea, they had sort of waivers under the old sanctions if they just reduced their imports. And so they were allowed to keep taking it, but they had to significantly reduce imports. I don't see any waivers for companies or for countries under Trump and John Bolton, the new national security advisor, and Mike Pompeo will be confirmed hopefully as Secretary of State. They're aligned with Trump on this policy, and they're going to be implementing the policy. So I think it's going to be a much more stricter implementation of the sanctions that might have been under McMaster or Tillerson. So I do think it's going to be closer to the 1 million barrels a day, and that's going to be, even if it doesn't happen right away, I think the market's going to be anticipating that. And I think you're already seeing some of that starting to get factored into prices now.
Yep.
If you look at options in May and later in the summer, you're seeing.
So you have a very tight oil market to begin with. These sanctions get implemented. That takes another 1 million in production off the market. I think that's at a minimum going to keep prices high, if not drive them higher. And then we have President Trump, on the other hand, saying prices are too high this morning.
That's right. And so a lot of people are saying, well, yes, but this catalyst is the Iran oil sanctions, and we had I've already seen stories today talking about, well, if Trump doesn't want oil prices to go up, he shouldn't impose the oil sanctions. He shouldn't be talking about sanctions on Venezuela. But I think that's sort of missing the point. I mean, in terms of what's behind the Trump tweet. Some of it may have to do with gasoline prices, which have been creeping up. They're up about 30 cents from a year ago. But there really has not been that much coverage of higher gasoline prices yet. I mean, we could see it this summer as we enter the summer driving season. But, oil prices and gasoline prices in the U.S. have been relatively low over the last couple of years. So I'm not sure that's a hot button issue yet in voter land. So I'm not sure Trump is really focusing on that. Instead, I think he is kind of positioning, doing some positioning ahead of this Iran oil sanctions decision. So, number one, I think the market should take it as another indication that it's going to happen. And number two, I think he's trying to get ahead of the blame game on who's responsible for high oil prices.
Right.
And I think he's going to be pointing the finger at OPEC
Yep.
Because of this agreement. And in addition to that, because he doesn't want to take the blame for it, but in addition to that, I think he's going to, the implications of it are going to be, I think pressure by Trump on OPEC and Gulf producers in particular who are aligned with him on this Iran policy to increase production because of the disruption. And so that's something that I think was completely unforeseen until the Trump tweet. And so OPEC and these Gulf producers are going to have to be dealing with this, and we may be dealing with it at the June OPEC meeting, which will make for another exciting couple days in Vienna.
Right.